When you think of team orders in Formula One, one team usually springs to mind, and that is, of course, Ferrari. Not just for what's going on at the moment, the team seems linked throughout its recent history and through various stages of management and driver lineups to the subject of team orders. But I'm here with Ben Anderson and Jake Boxall-Legge to discuss what's gone on so far in 2019, particularly with the Chinese Grand Prix, where Charles Leclerc was ordered to move aside for Sebastian Vettel. And it didn't really work for Ferrari. It was a gamble to try and get them in the race with Mercedes, and nothing really came of it. If anything, their result ended up worse. But where do we stand on Ferrari's use of team orders, Ben? Was this a good idea or a bad idea? Should they have just left the race alone?
Well, I certainly admired their decisiveness after all the sort of pointless prevarication we've gotten used to recently under the previous regime. At least they're taking a decision, going with it, sticking to it. Ultimately, they were damned if they did and damned if they didn't. The decision was clearly born of a desire to go after Mercedes, as you mentioned. Leclerc wasn't really making inroads into Valtteri Bottas. He struggled a bit over the China weekend. He wasn't the fastest Ferrari driver as he was in Bahrain. So it made sense in that context to give Vettel a go to see if they could go after Bottas. But unfortunately, Vettel didn't really make the most of his opportunity. He made some quite key mistakes shortly after being let through. So the race kind of got away from Ferrari. Ultimately, Red Bull were always going to pull the trigger from behind because they had nothing to lose with Verstappen, no challenge from the midfield. So the only way Ferrari could have played that race better is to write Mercedes off as the faster team, not go after them and focus on protecting what they had, which would have been third and fourth. But that's very difficult when you're a title challenging team meant to be running at the front. You've got to be aggressive and go for a better result, not really just consolidate what you have.
JBL, Ben's kind of outlined the case for Ferrari there, and there is some logic behind it if a team's being ambitious rather than settling for third and fourth. Where do you stand on this? Do you think they were right to make the switch when they did?
No, definitely not. Leclerc, when Vettel overtook Leclerc, beforehand anyway, their paces were pretty much of a muchness. And Vettel was making no inroads into Leclerc anyway, so even with a massive straight in DRS, he was doing nothing. And you go, okay, let's switch positions and see, and nothing happened.
Except for Vettel driving quite badly for a few
yeah,
laps.
Exactly, and it was a pointless exercise, and to try and cover themselves off, Leclerc ended up on this weird strategy where he was just sort of left in the middle of nowhere and ends up in fifth position. So it was just, I don't understand it, I really don't.
Yeah, it was a real disaster for Leclerc's race subsequently.
And Christian Horner described him as being hung out to dry.
Yeah, and he was. I mean, I guess Ferrari kind of ran out of ideas after their gambit to go after Mercedes failed, and Leclerc was kind of Kimi Raikkonen, wasn't he? His strategy looked like the sort of pointless run massively long on the wrong tyre and see what we can do maybe at the end.
While we focus on the other car.
Absolutely, yeah, that they used to give Kimi to do, and he would soldier on valiantly and at the end go, oh, this is no good. But, you know, at least they abandoned that. I mean, Leclerc didn't run too much longer before pitting for harder tyres. Ultimately, they should have reacted a bit quicker to the fact that they failed with their earlier strategy, because Leclerc only finished a handful of seconds behind Verstappen, and maybe if the tyre life was holding up, obviously we don't know exactly, he could have had a go at Max if he'd pitted earlier. Certainly they should have brought him in as soon as possible once they'd covered Verstappen with Vettel.
Jake, we've had 3 races now in the 2019 F1 season. In each of those races, Leclerc has had a message at some point regarding how he should be racing Vettel. So in Australia, he's told to stay behind him in the final stint. In Bahrain, he was told to stay behind him for a couple of laps and didn't, and took the lead. And then obviously what we've seen in China. So Ferrari is having to manage this a lot already. Should we read much into the fact that they really do seem to be nailing their colours to Vettel's mast at this stage?
Well, they definitely are. Everything seems to be done to sort of placate him and keep him a little bit happy, because in seasons gone by, we mentioned Raikkonen. He's been very, very compliant in everything Ferrari wanted to do. This year, Leclerc is. I think the problem is that Ferrari said at the very start, they set out their stall and they said, okay, we're going to have team orders in favour of Vettel until Leclerc proves himself otherwise. Leclerc's already proved himself. We're 3 races in. I don't think Ferrari expected that, and they've been caught off guard by it, and they don't know what to do. And I think Vettel might be, I'm not going to say unhappy with the situation, but I don't think he was expecting it either. And at this point, they need to let both cars race, because otherwise you're going to end up in a situation with China where someone's going to be behind. Like by the end of the race, Leclerc was doing, I think he's like mid 136s, and Verstappen and Vettel were in high 37s, 38s. So the drop off wasn't there. So the strategy made no real sense. It was bizarre, and Mercedes have two drivers that they let get on with things. Hamilton and Bottas, they're allowed to do whatever, and it seems to be working well for them. They're 1 and 2 at the top of the standings. Ferrari have got Verstappen in the way now, and it's detrimental. They just need to let the two of them get on with it, because they can both handle it.
There's arguably a point there that Ferrari, as we said, turned a 3-4 result into a 3-5. You guys mentioned that Raikkonen was perhaps a bit more compliant in the past. A lot of that compliance tended to come from the fact that he wasn't quick enough to be in the way and to be asked to be moved aside. So what we've seen so far, does that set the scene that this is going to be a topic that runs throughout the season now? If we accept that Ferrari's new signing Leclerc has made the step up and is on the level where he's always going to be in and around Vettel's race on a Sunday afternoon, is Ferrari going to have this problem just basically for the duration of the season?
Yeah, most likely, but it's a problem that is nice to have, and surely they wanted to have as well when they made the decision. Having Raikkonen in the car wasn't doing great business for their Constructors' Championship hopes. They wanted a driver that could get closer to the team leader, so that essentially you've got a guy that can get in the mix with the Mercedes drivers when you've got a chance of taking points off them, which Raikkonen wasn't really doing enough. Of course, the flip side of that is you've got a guy who's hungry, young, wants to win the title himself. At the moment, he's compliant, but he's not happy about it. So that takes some managing. But Ferrari's bigger problem is that the car's just not quite there. The form they showed in pre-season testing was outstanding. It didn't translate to Melbourne. They were much more on the case in Bahrain, though it looks like Mercedes underestimated their drag levels from Bahrain, and maybe they corrected that for China. Ferrari's car not where it should be in China, and it's these decisions over what you do with the strategy and how you let your drivers compete with each other is much easier when your car is quicker than the rest and you haven't got so much to worry about. Ferrari are finding themselves pincered between Mercedes, who are stretching away from them, it looks like at the moment, and Red Bull, who are coming up fast from behind. Verstappen was much quicker in China than he looked in qualifying. He missed that final run in Q3. And ultimately they were caught between those two places, that rock and that hard place. You know, they weren't quick enough to go after Mercedes, which is what they were trying to do. But also they weren't really thinking of covering off Red Bull, because that required such a conservative strategy that they would have had to eliminate Mercedes from their thinking entirely. So solving Ferrari's problems starts with fixing the car. Leclerc and Vettel, really, that's a side issue. At the moment, backing Vettel means that at least they keep him in the championship hunt nominally while the car is no good. If you've got him and Leclerc taking points off each other, then that could potentially let Mercedes and Lewis Hamilton or Valtteri Bottas stretch even further away.
And Jake, you talked about Mercedes letting their guys race, and Ben said that's easier to do when your cars are out front and seemingly in a dominant position. We've seen Mercedes play the team orders game when they've needed to, but that tends to be at what we call the business end of the season. Every race is worth the same number of points, so quite why we always wait until the end of the year to do that is perhaps questionable as well. But can you see Ben's logic in that Ferrari needs to sort its car out, and can you understand Mercedes' logic in when they use team orders later in the year? And would that be acceptable for you from Ferrari?
I understand both points of view completely, and I accept that team orders, that's a part of Ferrari's game, but they're almost beholden by it, and it's like it's a part of their history that, as you mentioned at the top of the video, that it's something they've always done, but they seem to be like under pressure to do it, even though they're trying to undergo this change of image and not be the Ferrari of old. They're still sticking to it, sticking to that strategy, and they needed to see how Vettel and Leclerc would pan out. I think that would have been the ideal solution, and then if one of them is pulling away from the other, that's when you back them. I don't know necessarily if like taking points off of each other is such a problem at this point in time, because they're not really. I think I would argue now that team orders has taken more points away from both drivers than letting them go for it. So I think that it needs to sort of be weighed up. I think it's way too early.
Well, I think it's important to look at each decision they've made in isolation. It's easy to get carried away with this context of the season and preordaining Vettel as the chosen man. But if you look at Australia, the two cars nearly collided at the first corner. So in that context, it makes sense to make them hold position at the end of the race when you know you're not going to get a better result overall. Don't risk an accident. In Bahrain, Vettel got ahead of Leclerc at the start. That wasn't in the plan. Leclerc should have been leading that race already. Yeah, he's coming up fast. He's asking the team, well, what can we do? And they're just saying, well, can you just give us a couple of laps, or maybe Seb will pick up his pace. Leclerc, fair enough to him. He was so quick in that race. He could just get it done cleanly. They dodged a bullet. And in China, in isolation at that moment, when you're thinking, well, Mercedes are ahead of us, we need to try something at least to try and pick off the second car, which is what Red Bull did with the second Ferrari. Leclerc's not really making inroads. Seb seems to be quicker. It looked like he could run a bit closer to Leclerc than Leclerc could to him. Maybe that was just a strategic piece of driving. They tried, and ultimately it didn't work out. Vettel didn't drive cleanly enough. The car wasn't really fast enough. So you can understand those decisions in isolation. I think the context of the overall season is not, maybe leads us down the kind of wrong route in kind of hammering Ferrari at this stage. But yeah, ultimately, you don't want to be playing this card too often. You need these things to kind of resolve themselves before you have to get involved versus your opposition later.